this evening to Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 7. As I said, as I'm preparing for this series of messages, if the Lord allows this to go through, on our history and heritage as Baptists, and I'm trying to reapproach it, condense the material, kind of a fresh approach here. So there's a lot of these things that are on my mind. I've been reading, studying, trying to get a handle on it. And this verse is one, I'm not sure if Carol uses it in the Trail of Blood to introduce that, or where I came, this verse was brought to my attention. But this is one that we want to use to kind of introduce the subject. Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 7 says, "Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Ask thy father, and he will show thee, thy elders, and they will tell thee." And so, of course, we only have one verse. That is our key verse. And the topic is the years of many generations. Consider the years of many generations. Oral and written history is for the purpose of preserving and passing down to future generations the memory of our past. He says, remember. And that has to do with our memory. There are memories of the past generations that are passed down so that we who were not there and did not experience and see those things might know them. That memory is not lost, but is passed down to future generations. Notice Jeremiah 6:16. One of those go-to verses for me. I've used it many times. But it corresponds, goes along with this. "Thus saith the Lord, stand ye in the ways, and see and ask for the old paths, where is the good way, and walk therein, and ye shall find rest for your souls." But they said, we will not walk therein. But he says, stand in the ways. And what he's talking about, there are many different paths, roads, philosophies of life, religion, and everything, courses of action, lifestyles that are available to people. Our everyday lives is made up of choices pertaining to our lifestyle, how we're going to live our lives. And so here he says, stand in the ways. That is, look at all the different options that you have. Said, but ask for the old paths wherein is the good way. Now, not necessarily all old paths are good. But he specified the ones that are good. How do you know they're good? Because you can, it's far enough back, you can see what the consequences of those choices are. And what the consequences of ignoring those choices are. And so we see something of the importance here. Not just the past, but our past. It's personal. When we think of the past, it's impersonal. When we think of our past, it is personal. The previous generations, and this is why. The previous generations are the foundations upon which our lives now are built. We would not be who we are apart from those who have gone before us. Think about that. 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Notice what Paul is saying here, and we want to take his comment, because this is a part of and developing this thought about the years of many generations. Notice what Paul says here in verse 9, chapter 3, verse 9, "For we are laborers together with God." Think about that for a minute. Now, God has an eternal purpose. And in every generation, He has a people. He's calling out a people unto Himself. And as God's people, Paul said, we are laborers together with God in working out this purpose. Ye are God's husbandry, ye are God's building. According to the grace of God which is given unto me as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, and another buildeth thereon. But let every man take heed how he buildeth thereon. Now, there's a lot in that, and some of this applies to our thought this evening about the generations, every generation. Paul's generation, the generation of Jesus Christ and the apostles. He says, we've laid a foundation, and there's no other foundation laid that can be laid than that which is Christ. He is the foundation. And that foundation has been laid. And the foundation of the apostles, this has been laid. He said, now, future generations are going to come on, and we're going to build on that foundation, but let everyone take heed how he buildeth on that foundation. And so he goes on to elaborate, for other foundation can no man lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if any man build upon this foundation gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, stubble, it's talking about our work, our life. Every man's work shall be made manifest, for the day shall declare it, because it shall be revealed by fire. And the fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is. Notice, if you will, because what Paul is doing here, he's drawing upon an example, an illustration that Jesus Christ Himself gave in Matthew chapter 7 as the summary to the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 7 and verse 24. He said, therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine. Now going back to chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7 is what is expressed as Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, beginning with the Beatitudes. You know, blessed is the man, the Beatitudes. And so he's summarizing it here. Therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them. So that is the kind of the criteria here that he's setting forth. All these sayings of his, that hears them and doeth them. That doesn't mean you had to be present to hear him literally as he was speaking, but as his words recorded and repeated. Paul is basically repeating this in his words, making application of this in his statement there in 1 Corinthians. So I will liken him unto a wise man which built his house upon a rock. And the rain, and I think one of the other, the gospel said he digged down and laid his foundation upon the rock. And the rain descended and the floods came and the winds blew. It kind of sounds like California right now. And beat upon that house, and it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock. It had a solid foundation. And they had built well upon that foundation. They heard the sayings of Jesus Christ, and they kept them. Everyone that heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them not shall be likened unto a foolish man, which built his house upon the sand. The rain descended, the floods came, the winds blew and beat upon that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. So Paul says the foundation's been laid. No other foundation can be laid than that which has been laid, and that's Jesus Christ. But let every man take heed how he buildeth thereon. And so that is a challenge for every generation. What are you building when it comes to your life? Each generation builds upon the past to forge the present with a view to the future. See, we live in time. And time is a constantly moving. I was thinking about it's almost like a conveyor belt, and it's constantly moving. And you can be walking and just kind of walking in place, but your place on that conveyor is constantly changing as it's going past. See, what was out there in front of you is now under you, and the next step is going to be behind you. The future is becoming the present, which is becoming the past. And it's a constant, I don't know what you would call it, but it is a constant phenomenon that is taking place. History is constantly moving. The future becoming the present, which becomes our past. And I was thinking about this, and I don't have a chalkboard or something up here to actually draw on, but if you take a point, and this represents the present, and you draw a line through it, this is your direction going to the future. But if you don't know what your past is, see, depending on where, because you have 3 points, past, present, future. Now, depending on where you put that point for the past will determine the line that goes through the present and the direction you go in the future. If you think about it as a geometry question. So if we don't know our past, then we have no idea where we're going in the future. Exodus chapter 34. Exodus 34, verse 4. And he hewed 2 tables of stones, like unto the first. And Moses rose up early in the morning and went up to Mount Sinai, as the Lord had commanded him, and took in his hand the 2 tables of stones. And the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there, and proclaimed the name of the Lord. And the Lord passed by before him and proclaimed, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering, and abundant in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, and that will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and upon the children's children unto the 3rd and to the 4th generation. Now there's several times, and you can get a concordance and look it up and find all the references to the generations. And the word generation, I looked that up, and I don't know if I included that in here, as to the meaning of that word. But it has to do with a cycle. Repeat, a circle, a cycle. And so we see these cycles, and each generation is completing a cycle. And he says, unto the 3rd and the 4th generation. Now, He doesn't punish your grandchildren or great-grandchildren for what you did. That's not what He's saying. But you see the influence that certain sins are passed down. They're picked up. Attitudes are passed on from generation to generation because of the influence of the fathers upon their children. It can be positive or negative. And that influence then their children pick up and they pass on to their children, and so on. And so when we read in the Old Testament, talking about the kings, especially in Israel, Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who did make Israel to sin, and how many of his descendants that became kings, and it said, and they walked in the ways of their father Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who did cause Israel to sin. Now there's forgiveness and mercy in every generation that comes to the Lord. But where sin becomes ingrained and each generation follows in the steps of the previous generation, many times we see they get worse and worse. There's an old saying that the next generation what this generation excuses in moderation, or the next generation will do it in excess. Can't we just look around and see how true that is? Now, to the third and the fourth generation, how long a period of time is that? It'll overlap a century. 3 to 4 generations. Because they talk about a generation being 40 years. That entire generation that came up out of Egypt, that is from those who was of the age of 20 and up, that was able to go to war, perished in the wilderness. 40 years wandering in the wilderness. But in reality, there's a lot of overlapping in these generations. 3 to 4 generations can span a century of time. The very unit of measure that we use on our church history chart. We kind of break it down century by century. And so we have 20 centuries from the time of Christ, from the 1st century AD to the present. What can happen across 3 to 4 generations? You know, a lot can happen in 100 years. And we talk about generations. And, well, we have 2 families represented here right now. If Matt and him was here, it would be a 3rd family. And there's 2 generations there. There's 2 generations of this family. Of course, just 1 generation right here that is represented. But some things just recently had me think about this. Our granddaughter in that study that she was doing. I'm going to use, just as an example, I don't like to, and I don't usually use things about myself necessarily, but that's my experience. This is what I'm familiar with, so I'm going to use this as kind of an example. Now, my forebear that I know of, Joseph Works, was born in Ireland in 1758. So using that as kind of a starting point, as generation number 1. Came to America, settled in Kentucky in the 1790s, died in 1823. Now, what did his life overlap? Now, he wasn't in America during the Revolutionary War, but he was alive during the Revolutionary War. He was present during the War of 1812. You know, the things that we read about. And I was just thinking about this. there was a large contingent of Kentuckians that fought with Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans at the end of the War of 1812. I don't know. I might have had some ancestors that fought there. He had a son, Thomas, that was born in 1796. And there was some confusion. At first they thought it was the same one. Now they think there was like a Thomas and then a Thomas Jr. And if that's so, we know the birth of the Thomas Sr. and the death of the Thomas Jr., but we're not too sure when the Sr. died or when the Jr. was born, because at first they count him as the same person. That he had 5 children by his first wife and 10 children by his second wife. Now they're thinking maybe that's 2 different generations. But Thomas was born in 1796, lived in Kentucky, had 5 children. Thomas Jr. was born, lived in Kentucky, had 10 children, and he died in 1876. And then his son, John A. Works, was born in 1842, fought in the Civil War, had 8 children, died in 1896. So if you go back, Thomas was born in 1796, John A. died in 1896, that's 100 years. And so Joseph overlapped Thomas Sr., and is part of that, so you have the 3rd and 4th generation, 100 years. Now John A. has a son who was born before he died, so within that 100 years, Arthur Lee was born in 1888. That was my granddad. His dad died when he was, I think, 8 or 9 years old. He relocated to Scott County, next to Fayette County, Kentucky. I don't know, on Facebook they posted a picture of Shiloh Baptist Church in Corinth, Kentucky. That's where John A. and his wife are buried, is in Corinth, Kentucky. That's up where they originally settled. Actually, John A.'s wife moved and brought my grandfather to Scott County, which is next to Fayette County. And she died there, but was taken back and buried there in Corinth with her husband. And my granddad, Arthur Lee, had 4 children. He died in 1959 when I was 8 years old. One of his children, Robert Works, was born in 1912 and died 2000 something. I didn't write. 2008, 2009, 2008. Okay. And so my older brother Robert was born in 1940. I was born in 1951. So we're the 7th generation. But you go back, you know, and go down to the 8th generation, which includes my brother's children, my children. Thomas Morgan was born in 1996, which is 100 years since John A. died in 1896. So from 1796, when the first Thomas was born, to the second Thomas, when he was born, is 200 years. And I got to think, what all happened in that time? I had the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812. There was also, in between there was an undeclared war with France, and there was the war with the Muslim pirates in the Mediterranean. The War of 1812, the war with Mexico, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the war in Iraq, Iran, the war on terrorism. And that's just the wars, and that's not all of them, but the ones primarily that are in U.S. history that we were involved in. And I think of all the inventions. How many times have you seen somebody post on there, do you remember this object? Have you ever used one? It might be a can opener. It might be an old wringer washer. It might be a scrub board. But I remember those. I remember a butter churn my grandmother had. I remember a hand pump and an outhouse, and there's a lot of things that I grew up with that I know. I remember the old black and white TV my dad had, radio, and we never had a telephone until we lived there on Johnson Road the second time. And it was put in my name. I was a teenager, young adult, and I had the phone put in my name. It was a party line at first. You talk about that, people today, a lot of young people today will have no idea what that would be. But you just think, in 200 years, 7 to 8 generations, from beginning with Joseph in Ireland in 1758 down to Thomas Morgan, who was born in Seattle, Washington, Tacoma General, which is in Tacoma, Washington. There we go. Tacoma, Washington. And now lives in Michigan. Anyway, so you see the migration of families from Ireland to one part of Kentucky, to another part of Kentucky, to California, Washington, Michigan. And all the inventions and things that have occurred during those lifetimes, all the experiences. And there's a lot in this whole idea of the generations to the third and fourth generations. And so, I think we just begin to scratch the surface of DNA and different things. It is amazing. And when you think about it, we literally, our previous generations are who we are. They contribute so much to who we are. The name Works is Anglo-Saxon in origin. Something about history. The Angles and the Saxons, we studied church history. Those was one of the Germanic tribes that came down into Europe. And the Angles and Saxons in particular came over into Britain. And that's where it gets the name England today, was from the Angles and the Saxons, Anglo-Saxon. Back in that day, they was kind of the bad guys. The Britons looked upon them as the bad guys, the invaders. They settled and took over. And it's what they call an occupational name. That is based on what they did. And it meant a builder of the fortifications or earthworks. They built the forts, fortifications, defensive positions. I didn't know that. Had no idea. But I used to build forts out of bales of straw in the lofts in the barn. And it is still talked about to this day by some of the kids. What is in our DNA? Some people cannot stand bagpipe music. It's just screeching. I always liked it. I don't know why. So my ancestors came from that part of the country. Now, Lou's last name is Spencer. That's French. They also invaded England. William the Conqueror from Normandy. So the English invaded them back through Normandy later. But it means the dispensers of the goods. They, like groceries, store owners, shopkeepers. Her grandfather and father, or her grandfather had grocery stores at a couple of different times in his life, amongst other things, other occupations he did. We won't repeat all of them. That's what the name meant. You know, so sometimes you see generations down repeating or following in the steps of the generations before. But I was just thinking about this. Now, is there somebody in the Bible you can identify with that was a dispenser of the goods? How about Joseph in Egypt? You know, through the wisdom and all given to him, Pharaoh put him in charge, and when they had the good years, they collected the excess and all and put it in the storehouse. And he was over the storehouse and the dispensing of those things during the time of the famine. So that's a good occupation. How about builders of the fortifications and the walls? Nehemiah. See, I think it's important that we understand and have a connection to the past. And everybody can do this. I mean, not just myself or my wife. Everybody has a past. Everybody has those generations that has gone before. And we're building our lives in the present upon that foundation that was laid by those who have gone before us. And that's why this is so important. And why God has placed such an importance upon that oral and written history of the generations that have gone before us. That we're to remember, that we're to preserve, and to pass down to future generations. Notice what Paul told Timothy, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2. And the things that thou hast heard of me. Now Paul's talking about he was a wise master builder. And everyone's going to come along and is going to build upon that foundation. But let him take heed how he buildeth thereon. Notice what Paul says to Timothy here. He said, those things that thou hast heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to faithful men, who shall be able to teach others also. Paul's first generation. Timothy is second generation. Because he was saved under the ministry of the Apostle Paul. Now Paul's telling him, now you take the same things and you find faithful men. You pass it on to the next generation. With the intent that they will pass it on to the generation following them. There's 4 generations. The 3rd and 4th generation. And in church history, we're talking about 1st, 2nd century. We're talking about lives that overlap. Because it began in about the middle part of the latter part of the 1st century and continued on into the 2nd century of these men's lives, and perhaps overlapping over into the 3rd century. What Paul's instructions here to Timothy, Paul had a vision of the future looking on, and he was trying to do something in his generation to pass on to the next generation that would continue for at least 2 more generations. And this is nothing new. Paul is observing a principle laid down by God in the Old Testament. Many examples of this, but notice in Joshua chapter 4. Verse 1 through 7, and it came to pass when all the people were clean passed over Jordan, that the Lord spake unto Joshua, saying, take you 12 men out of the people out of every tribe of man, and command ye them, saying, take you hence out of the midst of the Jordan, out of the place where the priest's feet stood firm, 12 stones. And ye shall carry them over with you, and leave them in the lodging place where ye shall lodge this night. Then Joshua called the 12 men whom he had prepared of the children of Israel out of every tribe of man. And Joshua said unto them, pass over before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan. And take ye up every man of you a stone upon his shoulder, according unto the number of the tribes of the children of Israel, that this may be a sign among you, that when your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, What mean ye by these stones? Then ye shall answer them, that the waters of Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, when it shall pass over Jordan. The waters of the Jordan were cut off, and these stones shall be for a memorial unto the children of Israel forever. So in the generations to come, when the children saw these stones and asked, because they weren't there, they did not see it. But that generation that did, that crossed over Jordan, can tell their children or their grandchildren, because their children may have been children when they crossed over, and may have vague memories of it. And so this is where one generation overlaps the lives of several generations. Job, his family that he had after the trials that he went through, and he saw his children, his children's children, and his children's children's children. His life overlapped those generations. And so his first-hand account, and the same thing with Adam and different ones. You think about Adam, who lived 930 years. Well, he overlapped several generations. You get quite a few generations in 930 years. So that the account of creation, when it came down to Abraham, was only like third or fourth hand, because of the overlapping of the generations. Because Shem overlapped the life of Abraham. And so those accounts that were passed down orally were recent. It was in that person's lifetime. Happened hundreds of years before, but it was in that person's lifetime that's telling it. Now that our lifespans are a lot shorter, we don't get as much of an overlap, but it is there. And so this is the principle. Verse 19:24, same chapter here. And the people came up out of Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and encamped at Gilgal in the east border of Jericho. And those 12 stones which they took out of Jordan did Joshua pitch in Gilgal. And he spake unto the children of Israel, saying, When your children shall ask their fathers in times to come. And he's talking about future generations, not just your direct children, because their children would have been present there, they'd have been young, but they might remember it. But he's talking about in the future generation, your descendants, when they ask their fathers, in time to come, saying, What mean these stones? Then ye shall let your children know, saying, Israel came over this Jordan on dry land. He said, For the Lord your God, He dried up these waters, and so on. So this is a principle, a generation, a cycle of time. 2 Peter chapter 3. And Peter opens this chapter. He doesn't open the letter, but in his second letter, chapter 3, he says, This second epistle, beloved, I now write unto you, in both which I stir up your pure minds by way of remembrance, that ye may be mindful of the words which were spoken before by the holy prophets, and of the commandment of us the apostles of the Lord and Savior. He said, I want to stir up your minds by way of remembrance. And this is what we need to do. Every generation needs to do this to the future generations. Those things have been passed down. We talk about church history. We talk about different things. And it's not that. We talk about 20 centuries. You get 3 to 4 generations per century. That's only 80 generations in 2,000 years. You'd think it might be more, but it's not. That's only 80 generations. You have 4 generations per century, 20 centuries, 2,000 years. That's 80 generations, 60 to 80. So, to stir up your minds by way of remembrance, that you be mindful, not just hear it in one ear, out the other, but that you would be mindful, that you would remember, that you would think about these things. Because they're important. Our history is important. Because the experiences of the former generations is the foundation of which our experiences are built. The direction that we take is influenced and can be laid out for us if we understand our history. There's the old saying, if you don't remember the mistakes of the past, you're doomed to repeat them. But there's a flip to that as well. If we know and understand the right choices that the former generations have made, and we duplicate them, then we can duplicate their successes and victories. There's a positive to that negative. And that's what we need to do. And that's what we need to encourage and instill in our young people, that history is important. It can be personal. You know, talk about the Irish and different things. That part of Kentucky, because one of the things my brother discovered, and this was when I was living in California. We had no idea, because my great-grandfather, who had served in the Civil War, died when my grandfather was like 8 or 9 years old. And they moved away from that part of the country. So there was kind of a separation from all that history and everything. And so all that we knew when it came down to my dad, my brother, myself, was that they had come from that part of the country, up around Owen County, Kentucky. And he was passing through there one time, so he stopped, went to the county clerk's office, and was inquiring. Well, evidently, part of the family that had moved away and become doctors and lawyers somewhere in Indiana, Illinois somewhere, had come back and researched, and they had the librarian there that did a lot of the research work for them. And so they directed my brother to her. She'd already done the research, had it all out there, and gave it to my brother. And so then he writes and lets me know, hey, guess what, about our family and so on. And one of the things that he had that he sent me was a copy from the clerk's book that showed all the homesteads around there. The Workses, the McFarlands, the Irelands, the Davises, they're all Scotch-Irish names. And I said you could almost, because when you read some of the history, Joseph's daughter Elizabeth married a McFarland. And so you look, well, here's the Works farm, here's the McFarlands. I said you can almost imagine cutting across the fields to go courting with one another, or meeting up when they had some kind of harvest thing or something. But something else they did, they showed all the churches in that area. And I don't know, there was 5 or 6 churches. Maybe it was 5, something like that. They were all Baptists except for one. Down in the corners was one little lone Methodist church. But they was all Baptists. I know my granddad was a deacon in a Baptist church there in, I think it was Woodford County. But anyway, there were Baptists in Ireland. Did they become Baptists once they got over here because that's all there was? Or were they Baptists in Ireland and Scotland before they came over here? If you study church history, there was associational minutes that had been preserved of the Irish going back to the 1600s in Ireland. Long before Joseph was born in Ireland. And so there is a possibility that they were Baptists in Ireland before they ever came over here, and there was Baptist churches there because that's what these people were when they came. I don't know. But we must remember that heritage. Now, I am a Baptist today, not because my granddaddy was a Baptist, but the Lord in His sovereign grace, if you will, put me under the preaching of the gospel in a Baptist church. And that's where I was saved. That's where I was baptized. I am today a Baptist because as I've studied the Bible, what I believe to be the truths of God's Word identifies me as a Baptist. But we see there is to the third and fourth generations, but also that's of those that sin against Him, that He will visit the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations of those that hate Him. See, every generation there in that statement is a generation that hates God. But He also shows mercy, grace, forgiveness, those that will repent in every generation. The cycle of sin can be broken, and when it is. And so, we must remember the good and the right way of the past generations. Because how else can we hope to duplicate their success and achieve like victories? So when we go back to the verses we started with, Jeremiah 6:16, he said, stand the ways, seek and ask for the old paths, wherein is the right way, and walk in them, and you'll be blessed. Now if you don't want to learn that, and that was the sad thing, they said, we will not walk therein. And that's kind of like today. We see this in our country. We see it in the politics and things. You can look back. You can see socialism doesn't work. It has never worked. It's never been successful. But there's people that don't care. They think they're going to make it work. Or maybe they know it doesn't work and that's not what they want it for. They want it to not work. They want us to adopt it. So knowing that it won't work, to destroy our economy. Well, as a people, those foundations that our forefathers laid, take heed how you build their own. It will be tried. Deuteronomy 32 said, remember the days of old. Remember. Consider. And don't just remember, it's not just dates and places and names. These are people. These are lives. Just like you and me. Men, women, boys and girls, men and women fell in love, got married, had children. They had to make a living. They had to struggle. They had, and all the influences. Like I said, in the 200 years, the 7, 8 generations, how many wars have come to pass, have occurred during the lifetime of those generations? Just about every generation has experienced war. People died. People lost loved ones. and had to continue on, and so on. So remember the day. Consider. Think about it. What does this mean to you? How does this affect you? Because it does. In ways you may not understand. I think there's more to DNA than what we understand. How can an aptitude toward building forts be passed on through generations? And it may not show up in every generation, but in some of those descendants it'll pop up. Or a tendency to have a grocery store, or whatever else, to be a mechanic, to be an artist, to be a preacher, to, whatever. I've done a little bit of everything. So back there somewhere in all this, and I think about this, all of that started with one primary set of DNA, just one, Adam. So what about Eve? She was taken from his bone. She had the same DNA that he had. There is one primary set of DNA that we all have inherited. Now, in different places, different locations, different combinations, and so on. But we don't really understand what all is in that. But, when the psalmist said, when David said, I am fearfully and wonderfully made, it is the truth. Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. There's many generations that have preceded us in the faith, in the history of the Lord's churches. 2,000 years span of time, as we said, 60 to 80 generations. The years of many generations. Ask. That's a responsibility laid upon this generation, upon each generation. I remember my grandmother talked about things, and I was young, and I wish I remembered more and maybe asked more questions as I got older before they passed. We need to ask. We need to find out. That's what we're commanded to do. We're encouraged and exhorted to do. It said, ask thy Father, and he will show thee. Ask thy elders. Those that are still alive of previous generations that go back even beyond your father. And they'll tell thee. Seek and ask for the old paths where it is the good way. You see, that is what we need to do. And I hope that this has encouraged people. And as I said, the thoughts for this kind of came from the studying and preparing for the series of messages we hope to do, Lord willing, on our church history and heritage as Baptists, as the Lord's true New Testament churches. That we need to be mindful of the struggles that the previous generations of Baptists have gone through. Their successes, their failures, we need to understand. Because when you stop and think about it, the Catholic Church exists because of the failure of Baptist churches to remain pure. They allowed themselves to become corrupted. Satan didn't create something new. He took what the Lord had created and established his New Testament churches. He said, I'll build my church. The gates of hell shall not prevail against it. But Satan was able to corrupt some and turn them away from the Lord. And the further once he kind of got them going that direction, more and more were added to them. They began to duplicate after their own image and likeness, if you will, and to further corrupt, and became what is today the Roman Catholic Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, and all the Protestant churches that came out of that, and all this other stuff. Back in the beginning, there was only the Lord's churches. And Satan corrupted them. So it's important, because there's nothing new. The corruptions that we face today are the same ones that they faced back in those days. And we need to understand. We need to go. We need to ask. We need to remember these things. What was it they faced? What was it that corrupted these churches? The same corruption is eating away at churches today. And that's what we need to see and to realize and to be able to recognize and identify. Let us stand together. Hymn 139.